Well, look, I mean, it's not for me to kind of comment too much on the Victorian situation. They're going through a very difficult time, but what I would say has been very successful in New South Wales has been the tracking and tracing and the testing from our health team, and that certainly enabled us to open as much of the economy as possible. But look, there are challenges. Every jurisdiction around the country has its difficulties and challenges that come through it, and Victoria's gone through a very difficult time, and obviously they've got the advice that's in front of them. From my perspective, though, I think it'd be very easy to look at the day-to-day health cases and numbers that come through, and what can be lost are the downstream impacts that aren't being measured, and that is the impacts on jobs, the businesses that are struggling, and those that will eventually go under through this crisis. And in addition to that, the lack of opportunities for young people to get work down the track. So it's a balance of short-term priorities and the long-term economic impacts that are going to come through this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, and Daniel Andrews, and I do acknowledge that we're in a different state here, but he's suggesting that numbers have got to get way lower before they can ease restrictions, and there's so much talk about whether he's going for elimination or not. It certainly seems like he is, but in your opinion, is elimination at all possible?
Well, I'm not a health expert, Pete, but what I do get is I get the advice from our health officials when we have our routine debates between health and Treasury, and what I can say is that there's no evidence that I have received that would say that we can eliminate or eradicate this virus. And so, therefore, in those circumstances, what we have to have happen is have as much of the economy open as much as possible, living alongside the virus. And I just heard on the lead into this interview discussion around a vaccine, and that's incredibly positive, but there's still no evidence that we will actually have a vaccine and that vaccine will work. So in those circumstances, we need to make sure as much of the economy is functioning as possible. And the tracking, as I said, the tracking and tracing, and whilst we debate health a lot, the reality is our health response here in New South Wales, I think, has been incredibly positive. There's a long way to go. But early on in this crisis, we invested billions of dollars in our health system to almost triple our ICU capacity here in our state. And that, coupled with all of the work that health does day in, day out, I think has put us in a very strong position to keep our economy moving.
All right, well, on to more economic matters. Before your budget is handed down in November, we've got the federal budget next month. A lot of talk at the moment about whether the federal government should be bringing forward those Stage 2 and Stage 3 tax cuts. Is that something that you would support?
Absolutely. I'll always support a tax cut, Pete, and reducing government revenue that puts more cash in the pockets of families right across our state, and hopefully businesses as well. We obviously, I think, whether it's at a state level or a federal level, all governments are focused on putting the economy before the budget right now, and whether it's bringing tax cuts forward or temporary support that helps, I guess, drive our economies through this, I think we're all on the same. We're all on the same page there. So I read that over the weekend. That's what they're thinking of doing, and that I think would be a very positive thing, particularly in our state.
Josh Frydenberg wants the states to do more. Indeed, he said that on this program. He suggests that the Commonwealth spending right now is about 15.8% of GDP, while New South Wales is at about 2.4% of GSP. What are you going to do extra?
Well, we've invested over $16 billion, Pete, in stimulus measures. We've got our budget to be handed down on November 17, and where we can do more, we will. We've also, what the Federal Treasurer is not taking into consideration in those statements is obviously the levers that we have available to us at a state level. And one of those key areas is infrastructure investment, and we've increased our infrastructure here in our state to over $100 billion over the next 4 years. We're bringing forward shovel-ready projects, small projects that we can get off the ground quickly to keep people in work. But infrastructure is only one side of it. At the same time, we want to provide support, cash support for businesses. And there's a whole range of areas that we have invested in, and in the lead up to this budget, we will continue to announce, because we will do whatever it takes to help guide our state through this crisis. And that's going to obviously come at the expense of the budget, but it's the right thing to do. And at the same time, working with the federal government, more than happy to continue to work with Josh and making sure that our measures are complementary to the federal government's proposals as well.
What sort of a deficit are you looking at?
Oh, it'll be in the billions, Pete. And obviously, I haven't we haven't settled on a final figure there, and usually we'd start with the point of where we wanted to land on that when we started the preparation for the budget. That's the furthest thing from my mind right now. What I'm completely focused on is making sure the budget hands down the support measures that are required to help get our state through this. And wherever that ends up landing from a fiscal position, it doesn't mean we're not focused on ensuring fiscal discipline. We are, and we want to make sure that every single dollar that we have at our disposal goes towards driving jobs growth, productivity growth and economic growth.
Well, a couple of ideas that the restaurateur Luke Mangan, he was on our program last week, that he suggested. He wants to open up the streets if possible and allow diners to be able to, you know, to have their meals outside, similar to how the Europeans do it. There's a couple of different points he made, but does that have merit, that idea?
Yeah, it does. And I met with him last week as well. And one of the things that I think we certainly need to be focused on is this whole government bureaucracy and regulations and red tape just build up over time. And we're not in ordinary times. And I think we need to look back and say, well, hold on, what is actually going to help our economy, particularly the Sydney CBD, I believe, get through this. And these restrictions that a lot of them are unnecessary, and that's not just at a council level, that's at a state level as well. The Planning Minister and myself are going to sit down with a whole lot of business leaders, stakeholders in Sydney, and see what we can do. But you can't have this whole pre-pandemic thinking really dictating to what's going to stop our drive, the economic growth out of this pandemic.
He also says that the government needs to address payroll tax and fringe benefits taxes. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yep. Absolutely, I do. And we have increased the payroll tax threshold here in our state from around $750,000 to $1 million. During this pandemic, we've deferred payroll taxes to give as many businesses as much cash flow as possible so they can keep their staff on. So from a payroll tax perspective, very keen to continue to look at that, as well as other initiatives as well. Obviously, FBT is something at a federal government level, but that's probably an area that we can work with the Commonwealth to make sure we look at every opportunity available, and as I said last week, everything should be on the table to make sure government gets out of the way and allows business to operate as freely as possible, because that's going to make sure they can keep as many people in work. All
right, Treasurer, just finally, the story in the front page of the Telegraph this morning. Apparently, New South Wales Treasury officials have been lecturing staff on the use of gender pronouns. So staff have been encouraged not to use words such as husband, wife or guys. Is that an instruction that's been given?
No, Pete, it's not. And obviously, I believe that people should be able to call their spouse whatever they like. Wife, husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, honey, babe, whatever, as long as we're focused where it should be. And I'll be making sure that people in Treasury are free to call their spouse whatever they like.